Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan.
Another May show, and I think we are just now past the frost, and everyone's putting everything in the ground.
It's a busy time. Yeah, there's a lot of planting and there's a lot of diseases that are exhibiting symptoms right now. So we get a lot of calls this time of year. And we've talked before about the fact that once you start seeing a fungal disease, it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
And so typically you need to apply fungicides earlier in the spring. So like
Yeah.
peach leaf curl, I'm getting a lot of peach leaf curl right now. It's been pretty bad this year, honestly. But another thing I'm getting a lot of calls about is rhododendrons.
Yeah. So rhododendrons and azaleas, even though they sound completely different, they're actually part of the same family. So being such close relatives to each other, they also share a lot of diseases. So if you're looking up fact sheets on and information on azaleas or rhododendrons, you typically find them grouped together. There's a lot of similarities in these two.
Yeah, they both have a thick, waxy, oval-shaped leaf, and they're both shrubs. And typically, your azaleas are going to bloom a little bit earlier than your rhododendrons, although not always. And typically, your azaleas are going to be a little bit smaller than rhododendrons. But they both like similar growing conditions with acidic soil and a high amount of organic material in the humus layer.
Yeah, in fact, they like really acidic soils. I mean, they're down there with the blueberries, 4.5 to 5.5.
Right. That's what makes them happiest. But they also don't like a lot of moisture. They like moisture in the air, but not necessarily in the ground. So they don't want to be flooded. And that's one of the leading causes of decline in a lot of our yard-based rhododendrons. We have our downspouts coming down at the base of our homes, and that's usually where we have our shrubby type plantings is up against the house. And so making sure your downspout isn't draining directly into your rhododendrons or your azaleas is step one in keeping them happy.
Yeah, you're right. Moisture breeds fungal diseases, and it doesn't really matter what plant it is. Just because you're resistant, if the pressure is high enough, you will succumb to the disease. It's that disease triangle, and everything has a tipping point. If you overwhelm one part of that disease triangle, it doesn't take much in the other parts to make it tip. So it's just kind of the way it goes. And having a lot of water in there, not only can you wash out nutrients and soil, but it does leave puddles, because if things get too saturated, they just don't drain. So then it's a breeding ground for fungal diseases. So you're right. Watching that location is going to be number one for not only rhododendrons or azaleas, but everything.
Yeah. And so also using mulch around rhododendrons and azaleas will go a long way to helping to keep that root moisture more standardized and make them feel like they're in the forest, which is where they really want to be. Also, avoiding direct winds in the wintertime. Sometimes you can get some winter injury from being exposed to those cold, drying winds, especially when the soil is frozen. So if we're going to have some really cold winter weather that has a high wind, putting a burlap around them or something like that to just reduce the amount of moisture coming out of the leaves from that wind, that can help reduce winter injury. But also they don't like direct sun. So they do need some shade to be super happy, especially when they're younger.
Yeah, they require some shade. So usually when we're talking about shading plants, that afternoon sun is usually the most intense. So ideally, you have sun in the morning and shade in the afternoon for a lot of these partial shade plants,
Hmm.
but it is a balance. So just kind of look and see what the situation is, which I guess makes sense to put them up against the house. And that's why, if the plant's happy where it is, it's going to thrive. So The fact that they are up against a house getting some shade, at least on one side, right? Minimal. And if they're thriving, we can see them because they're big.
But they aren't always thriving. A lot of our rhododendrons, like we said earlier today, are having some problems. And so we wanted to talk a couple of the different diseases that are common on rhododendrons and how to identify what they are, because you can't treat it until you know what it is. So, as always, we encourage you to reach out to your local extension office or to a reputable site to figure out what is going on with your plants. But when you're talking about fungal diseases, especially, it's very important to know exactly which fungal disease it is, because some fungicides work on some diseases and don't work on others. And also timing of those applications. We've talked a lot about making sure you're timing your pesticide applications effectively so that they actually work and they don't harm the plant.
And make sure you're taking care of the environmental causes of these fungal diseases.
Yeah.
We always say most fungicides, when we say most, it's like 90% of them. And, I might be a little off there, but most of them are all preventative. There's very few curative fungicides out there. And the ones that are curative are very expensive. So it might not be the best route to take care of a problem.
Yeah.
But just modifying the habitat, like you were saying, get mulch. Mulch is good. It holds in moisture. It does allow for runoff to not take soil away, and it prevents splashing. Like another thing about mulch, especially in gardens, is that you can't stop the rain. And
Mm,
you can't stop the rain. So the mulch is going to keep the soil from splashing back up and, and basically inoculating everything, because fungal spores are always ready. They're always at the ready in the soil level. And once they splash up and they realize that they're in an environment that both is high moisture and a host, meaning the plant, they will germinate those spores and infect the plant. And a lot of times at that point, if you're not doing anything to prevent the fungal spores from germinating, as an example, using most fungicides, you're going to have a disease problem.
right. So, if your rhododendron or azalea, mostly rhododendron for this one, um, is dying back in random places, just a random branch here and a random branch there, are becoming brown and the leaves are curling, and then they lay flat against the stem almost. They're just kind of like a folded umbrella, and the wood around them maybe looks a little brown, reddish brown. This is probably a Bottospharia canker or a stem canker, if you don't want to pronounce that lovely word. But if you prune that branch and look into it, the cross section almost looks like a little wedge pointing towards the center of the stem, where the pith or the center part of that stem is going to be a darker brown than the surrounding wood. And so that's going to tell you that this is more than likely the Bottospharia canker. And for this particular disease, it is a fungal disease, but it's really hard to treat a stem-based fungal disease because you can't just put the prevention on the leaves, because this particular one can go into any opening. So even a leaf scar, which is a natural place where the leaf has fallen off due to natural reasons, it can actually go in through that leaf scar. But any wound can be a point of entry for this fungus. So the best thing you can do is keep them in partial shade, mulched, well watered during dry periods. And if you see those dying branches, you should prune them out as soon as you can when it's dry. You do not want to prune any woody species during wet weather. So you want to prune them out, and you're going to take all of the wood that is discolored and then another 6 inches below that. Now, again, we've talked about keeping your pruner sanitized, especially when you are pruning a plant that you know has a disease. You want to make sure that before you make that clean cut at the end, get some rubbing alcohol, wipe off your blades, and then make that final cut. So that way you're not reinfecting your opening right away. do your best not to run into them with your lawnmower, or if they're growing out over something, in the where the branches might get pushed over or broken. You don't want to allow that to happen to them because again, any wound can be an opening for this disease. So, very important to take good care of it, and that is disease number 1 for today.
Yeah, and these botrytis type fungal diseases, they're ubiquitous is the word, right? So they're everywhere. That's why we always talk about the mechanism of infection because that's your best bet. Those cultural practices of aeration, proper placement, preventing splashing, even using a preventative herbicide at times. And I know it's a little bit beyond the cultural aspect of plant management, but doing some is much, much better than doing nothing. And doing a little bit of everything is obviously going to be the best.
Right.
So, manage them the best you can because the perfect solution is sometimes very hard to come by.
Right. And so disease number 2 on our list is actually Phytophthora. And so Phytophthora affects a lot of different plants, and there's a bunch of different Phytoptheras too. This is the same fungus that causes sudden oak death. So what it's doing is it's infecting the circulatory system and preventing the movement of the nutrients and water throughout the plant. So on rhododendron, it will make your plant look maybe a little wilted, maybe a little pale, a lighter green. And if you have a highly susceptible cultivar, it can actually die really quickly. But this is a root issue, and it's typically a bigger problem. It's always a bigger problem in very wet areas. So that's why we had started off with step 1, get that drainage away from your rhododendrons. And the main reason is for these root rot diseases that can really impact your plants and can fully kill them.
Yeah, the Phytophthora, sometimes you see them as root rots, and greenhouses have such a hard time with this disease. And if you look, we're actually looking at the Maryland Extension fact sheet on azaleas and rhododendrons, which is really good. For this one, it says the disease occurs when the pathogen is splashed onto the foliage. So that's what I'm talking about. Just having that mulch barrier there and maybe even pruning up a little bit higher off the ground will prevent the traveling of that spore that's everywhere from splashing up on the leaves. It starts in the leaves, it infects the circulatory system, and as plant physiology dictates, the circulatory system has to be tied from the roots to the leaves, and it's just like a highway of infection, and that will kill a tree a plant, because if you sever the connection from the leaves to the roots all the way around a plant, then there's no way for it to survive.
Right. And when you're looking at the symptoms of this disease, it's going to kind of look a lot like the Botrosphaeria canker, but the difference is that the Phytophthora is going to be at the root system and up through the stems, whereas the other one will just be in the stems. It doesn't necessarily affect the roots. It'll work its way down that way, but it's going to start up high. So you'll have the curling of the leaves, and the leaves are gonna stay attached to the stem, just like the other one, but the growth of the pathogen through the leaf tissue is gonna create that V-shaped lesion along that leaf midrib, and that's gonna go towards the stem. So it'll have like a V shape of decay, or, what am I trying to say, Dan? Necrosis, yeah, where
Necrotic
it's dead
tissue, yeah.
area, yeah, so
Brown.
a
I think word you're looking for is brown.
brown, yeah, so it'll be brown in a V shape. So if you do find out that the plant does have a Phytophthora fungus, there really isn't much you can do at that point. It's very heartbreaking. But there are some resistant varieties, and so if you are planting a new rhododendron, try to identify what killed the last one before you buy another one, so that way you can get one that's resistant to that particular problem, or you can know that you can't plant it in the same place.
That's what I was about to say. If it's just the conditions are right to breed diseases, like we were saying earlier, even if you have a highly resistant variety, if the pressure is high enough, nothing is immune. right? So just keep that in mind.
Yeah.
The environment plays a huge role, and sometimes resistant will buckle if the pressure's high enough.
This is true. Yeah, resistant does not mean that it can't get a disease. It just means it's less likely to, right?
Right, and you got to change that environment.
All right, so let's move to the flowers themselves and issues with them. So there is a disease called ovulina petal blight. So ovule, like the female part of the plant. So ovulina petal blight, where the flowers actually turn brown and then they remain attached to the plant. And this is caused by a fungus, and it only affects the flower petals of azaleas and rhododendrons. So you'll notice first there are some water soaked spots on the petals, which enlarge pretty quickly, and they cause the flower to kind of collapse and then feel slimy. So if they're dry, it's not the same thing. You want a squishy, slimy flower for this disease. It's most severe, of course, under moist conditions because that's when we have more fungi happening because they love that moist air. But flowers that are being affected by other fungi will not feel that slimy feeling. Same with if they're killed by frost or something. It's to know that it's the ovulina petal blight, you'll have the water soaked, slimy flowers. You will be able to see some fungal spores on the flowers if you use a magnifying lens, and they're going to remain on that flower and overwinter in the ground. And so those can live as long as 2 years in the soil. And again, when you have that rain splashing in the spring, it's going to splash it up onto the plant, into the new flowers, the new buds, and it will reinfect. So one of the issues I have, like my rhododendrons have the stem canker blight, which was the first one we talked about. And my biggest issue is when you have all of those fallen leaves and you know that those leaves can reinfect your plant, it's really hard to remove all of those leaves, right? Because you're trying to crawl underneath this great big rhododendron and scrape them out with your hands and pick them up and throw them away. But at the same time, you want to help to increase that organic matter in the soil underneath them and help keep that drainage going. And so sometimes I get to a point where I'm just like, okay, I've gotten as many leaves out as I can. Now I'm going to just bury them. And so I put a 2-inch layer of mulch over top of them, making sure they're completely covered so that they can't then splash up. And so a lot of those leaves are going to fall over the winter, and it's really hard to get out there first thing in the spring to get rid of them and cover them up. And so you have a balancing act that you have to do with those diseases that you have that are soil borne or debris borne. And you have to remember that you're only human and you can only do what you can do. But one of the things you can do is bury those old leaves.
And it's like we were talking about. Sometimes you just don't have the ideal situation, but you just got to understand the physiology and then the biology of what you're working with. I'm not saying like be a scientist, an expert in rhododendrons or azaleas or roses or the many plants that cause us grief. But just understand, preventing splashing really knocked out a lot of the diseases that we've been talking about. So just using mulch. Be careful though, because if you're having disease pressure and you have mulch, sometimes that mulch could be the source of inoculant
Yeah.
in your plant. So it's not a bad idea to, if you're having disease and you're seeing the disease and you have mulch, to replace the mulch. Just sweep it away, do something else with it, and then put clean mulch down. Because sometimes you have to do that as well.
This is true.
Airflow is always going to be your friend. Prune when it's dry. And when something dies or when something looks so bad that you don't, or it just becomes a headache to manage, you have to kind of weigh everything. What makes you want to keep a plant? Sometimes, no matter how hard no matter how good you are doing things, if the area is just not suitable for that plant, you're never going to get over the disease pressure and you're going to get that disease. And you just either have to put something else in there, change the environment. All right. So let's let's change it up a little bit and talk about galls.
But this isn't an insect gall, which is what we usually have, right?
That's absolutely true. The one that we're both looking at here is Exobasidium gall. This is another fungal disease
Yeah.
that causes galls. Galls, which are a generic term for undifferentiated growth. I really think galls are fascinating because you're talking about just cell growth, right?
Mhm.
There are really two major hormones that regulate cells and what they can do. They can either be a shoot cell, so they can be on top of the ground making leaves and stems and flowers, or they can be below ground, which essentially they're making roots. And there's really two hormones that kind of tip the scale one to the other because plants can, as you know from cuttings, they can start rooting from the stem, and that's like a hormone balance. But galls are just kind of a imbalance of the two hormones, and there other hormones play a part too, but it's mainly auxin and cytokinin, the two biggest ones. And a lot of pathogens have figured this out, and when they infect the plant, whether it's an insect or whether it's a fungus, they will offset that balance and create an undifferentiated growth where they can grow and thrive themselves. So they can basically use the plant machinery to build their own home that suits them and not so much the plant. So Karen's right. A lot of insects do this to reproduce, or they'll lay eggs in it, or they'll just live in it. And they're able to mimic this hormone that to them does nothing, but once they inject it into the plant, they can have a little place to live.
And so that makes galls really visible, and a lot of people get very nervous when they see these galls because it's just this big glob on their plant, like, "Oh my gosh, what's going on?" But 9 times out of 10, the galls really aren't harming the plant. And so they're not really impactful for the growth of that plant. It's just taking a little bit extra nutrients, adding a little bit extra space on that one leaf or on the flower, whatever, and more often than not, they're not really harmful. And that's how these exobasidiums galls, which are kind of a swollen, puffy portion that starts out on your leaves, your shoots, or your flowers. It can be on anything, but they turn into a little gall. It can be green, silvery white, pink, or red, depending on where it's infecting, and then they're going to develop a white surface, which consists of a layer of reproductive spores. And so, if you want these galls to be less frequent and go away, you're going to prune that off when before it gets that white layer on it, because those are the spores that are going to spread it for this particular gall. And so you do need to know that fungicides, they're not really going to help you here. So spraying it's even though it looks ugly and you want to deal with it, you just got to prune it out. It's a real simple fix. You can even hand pick them off in most cases, just, pinch them off with your fingernails, and that's gonna decrease your incidence, but know that it's not really causing a huge problem, and so it's not going to kill your plant, whereas some of those things that are less weird looking are much more insidious.
Well, and something that's pretty normal looking for most rhododendrons and azaleas are fungal leaf spots, which are
Mhm.
also very prevalent in roses. And I actually think that leaf spots in roses are much worse than they are in azaleas and rhododendrons. You get like that little brown circular lesion. It's fungal in this case, causes browning. Brown doesn't photosynthesize, so you get a reduction in photosynthetic capacity, and it just makes a slightly weaker plant. Usually not enough to take down the plant, just kind of little brown spots, which can be prevented by airflow, prevent splashing. Usually, a little circular fungal, a little circular black spot is reminiscent of a water droplet that's splashed.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and it's when you have these little leaf spots, you have to know that they're not really harming the plant. Most plants are going to develop more leaves than they actually need to be healthy, and that is so that these other organisms can have a home and survive. And it's just that whole ecosystem of plant life. And
The
so
circle of life.
yeah, and so a couple of spots here and there on your plant, on your rhododendron or your azalea isn't gonna kill it. So don't freak out. and do those standard management techniques that you should be doing just to keep them healthy. And of course, if you're choosing a plant, you want to select a resistant cultivar. Make sure it's healthy when you get it from the nursery and it's not coming with leaf spots or root disease. Um, and pay attention, so you may not be needing to spray something. And we need to stress, when you're using a fungicide, it's very important to not overuse fungicide, because then we have resistant fungi and we have a problem with controlling what we really need to control. So
Yeah, read that label because it will tell you how often you should use it. And I think most people overuse it.
this is true.
A lot of times we buy these products and you're not supposed to use them more than once every 2 weeks. And they do recommend alternating. So, just think about that. That's not very often. And some people use them quite a bit and they don't alternate.
Yeah.
And that causes resistance and that causes more problems.
Yes, indeed. And so, with that, we're going to wrap up today's show and let you know that if you want more information, that our friends at the University of Maryland Extension have an amazing page called Azaleas and Rhododendrons: Identify and Manage Problems. And there's a lot of great pictures that you can use to help you identify your problems on rhododendrons and azaleas. So please check that out. And we thank our friends from the University of Maryland for putting that together. And we thank you for listening. Hey, we just wanted to say thank you to everyone who has sent us an evaluation. That information is so very important. We are still looking for feedback from our listeners. So fill out that evaluation again and just let us know how you're using the information for the show. You can fill out these evaluations as many times as you want. And also, you can use those evaluations to tell us if there's a topic that you would like us to address. So we do welcome that. And we're always looking for new ideas on things that you feel are important. So let us know what you want to learn from our show. You can find the evaluation online at https://bit.ly extension calling evaluation. And that is an extension calling and evaluation all need to be capitalized, but those are the only caps you need to worry about. Or you can just call us at the office. You can reach me at 304-234-3673. That's 304-234-3673.
And you can also contact me at 740-695-1455. That's 740-695-1455.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.